Marcus Thompson had served as a Royal Protection Officer for 12 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on that cold February morning. The assignment seemed routine enough: monitor and document the charitable activities of the Duchess of Cornwall for security purposes. What started as a mundane task would soon unravel a web of connections that reached far beyond the palace walls. The morning began like any other in the security detail office. Marcus arrived at 6 sharp, his polished shoes echoing through the marble corridors of the palace. His supervisor, Chief Inspector Williams, handed him a thick manila folder containing months of financial records and charity documentation. "Thompson, I need you to go through Camilla's donation records," Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent protecting the royal family. "Standard security protocol. We need to ensure there are no questionable connections or potential security risks among the recipients." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of such responsibilities. In his years of service, he had learned that even the most innocent charitable acts could sometimes hide darker intentions. Money had a way of creating unexpected pathways, and those pathways could potentially compromise the safety of the royal family. Settling into his small office overlooking the palace gardens, Marcus spread the documents across his desk. The sheer volume was overwhelming: hundreds of donations, ranging from small contributions to local community centers to substantial grants for international humanitarian efforts. Each transaction was meticulously recorded, with dates, amounts, and recipient organizations clearly documented. As he began his methodical review, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the scope of charitable work being conducted. The donations painted a picture of someone deeply committed to making a positive difference in the world. There were contributions to children's hospitals, homeless shelters, educational programs for underprivileged youth, and disaster relief efforts across multiple continents. Hours passed as Marcus worked through the files, cross-referencing donation recipients with security databases and conducting background checks on various organizations. Most entries appeared straightforward: established charities with clean records and transparent operations. However, as the afternoon wore on, certain patterns began to emerge that caught his attention. He noticed that several donations had been made to smaller, lesser-known organizations that seemed to share common board members. At first glance, this didn't appear unusual. Many philanthropists preferred supporting networks of interconnected charities that could collaborate effectively. But as Marcus dug deeper, the connections became more intriguing. One organization, the Heritage Preservation Society, had received multiple substantial donations over the past 2 years. When Marcus investigated further, he discovered that this society was connected to at least 6 other recipient organizations through shared leadership and overlapping missions. What made this particularly interesting was that these connections weren't immediately obvious from the charity registrations themselves. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. Something about these interconnected donations felt different from the typical charitable giving patterns he had seen in previous security reviews. There was a deliberate structure to it, almost as if the donations were following a specific strategic plan rather than responding to individual charitable appeals. His curiosity piqued. Marcus began creating a visual map of the connections he was discovering. Using colored pins and string on a large corkboard, he started plotting the relationships between various organizations. What emerged was a complex web that seemed to center around a small group of influential individuals who appeared on multiple charity boards. As evening approached and the palace began to quiet down, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into this puzzle. The more he investigated, the more questions arose. Why were these particular organizations receiving such focused attention? What was the common thread that connected them all? And most importantly, was there any security implication he needed to be concerned about? One name kept appearing across multiple organizations: Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a prominent academic who seemed to sit on the boards of at least 8 different charities that had received donations. Marcus made a note to research Dr. Hartwell more thoroughly the following day. The security protocols required him to document any unusual patterns, but Marcus wasn't sure yet whether what he was seeing qualified as suspicious or simply represented sophisticated philanthropic strategy. The donations themselves were all going to legitimate registered charities, and there was no indication of any illegal activity or security threat. However, his instincts, honed by years of protection work, told him there was more to this story. The level of coordination and the strategic nature of the giving pattern suggested something beyond ordinary charitable impulses. It felt purposeful in a way that merited deeper investigation. As Marcus gathered his materials for the evening, he made copies of the key documents that had caught his attention. He locked the originals in the secure filing cabinet and prepared to head home to his small flat in London. But his mind remained focused on the puzzle he had uncovered. Walking through the quiet palace corridors toward the exit, Marcus reflected on the weight of his responsibilities. As a royal protection officer, he was tasked not just with physical security, but with identifying any potential threats or vulnerabilities that could compromise the royal family's safety and reputation. Financial connections could create dependencies or obligations that might be exploited by those with malicious intentions. The drive home through London traffic gave Marcus time to think about his next steps. He would need to expand his investigation to include detailed background checks on Dr. Hartwell and the other recurring board members. He would also need to map out the full extent of the network and determine whether there were any political or ideological connections that might pose risks. At home in his modest apartment, Marcus prepared a simple dinner and continued thinking about the case. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and his grown children lived in different cities, so evenings were often quiet times for reflection. Tonight, however, his mind was fully occupied with the mystery he had stumbled upon. Before going to bed, Marcus spent time researching Dr. Eleanor Hartwell online. What he found was impressive. She was a respected professor of international relations at Oxford University, with expertise in conflict resolution and post-war reconstruction. Her academic credentials were impeccable, and she had received numerous awards for her humanitarian work. But as Marcus dug deeper into Dr. Hartwell's background, he began to uncover connections that extended far beyond academia. She had served as an advisor to several government committees on international development, and her network included diplomats, policymakers, and influential business leaders from around the world. The more Marcus learned about Dr. Hartwell, the more he realized that the charitable network he had discovered might be more significant than he had initially thought. This wasn't just about money flowing to good causes. It was about creating connections and building influence across multiple sectors of society. As he finally turned off his computer and prepared for bed, Marcus felt both excited and apprehensive about what he might discover next. Tomorrow would bring new investigations and potentially new revelations about the true nature of the network he had uncovered. The last thing Marcus remembered before falling asleep was making a mental note to approach this investigation with extreme care. If his suspicions were correct, he might be dealing with something far more complex and potentially sensitive than a simple security review of charitable donations. Little did Marcus know that his careful documentation and growing suspicions would soon lead him into a world of influence and power that operated largely in the shadows, using charitable giving as one of many tools to shape policy and public opinion across the globe. The discovery he had made was just the tip of an iceberg that would challenge everything he thought he knew about how power really worked in modern society. The following morning arrived with an unexpected urgency that Marcus couldn't shake. After a restless night filled with questions about Dr. Hartwell and the charitable network, he arrived at the palace an hour earlier than usual. The security office was empty, giving him precious time to continue his investigation without drawing unwanted attention from his colleagues. Marcus began by expanding his research on Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, but this time he used the palace's enhanced security databases that provided access to information not available through standard internet searches. What he discovered painted a picture of someone whose influence extended far beyond the academic world. Dr. Hartwell had been quietly involved in numerous high-level international negotiations over the past decade. Her name appeared in classified briefings as an unofficial mediator in several sensitive diplomatic situations. She had connections to think tanks, policy institutes, and advisory councils that influenced government decisions across multiple countries. More intriguingly, Marcus discovered that Dr. Hartwell had been present at several private gatherings that included world leaders, business moguls, and other influential figures. These weren't official diplomatic events, but rather informal meetings held at exclusive venues around the world. The guest list read like a who's who of global power brokers. As Marcus delved deeper into the charity network, he began to see patterns that suggested a level of coordination that went beyond coincidence. The timing of donations often coincided with significant political events or policy announcements. For instance, a substantial grant to an education reform organization came just weeks before a major education policy initiative was announced by the government. The Heritage Preservation Society, which had received multiple large donations, turned out to have a particularly interesting focus. While ostensibly dedicated to protecting historical sites and cultural artifacts, the organization also funded research projects on geopolitical stability and cultural influence. Many of their projects involved regions where British foreign policy interests were at stake. Marcus created a detailed timeline, mapping donations against major political events and policy changes over the past 3 years. The correlations were too frequent to be coincidental. It appeared that the charitable network was being used to fund research and advocacy that aligned with specific political objectives. His investigation was interrupted when Chief Inspector Williams arrived unexpectedly early. Marcus quickly closed the files he was working on and tried to appear as if he was conducting routine security reviews. "Making progress on those charity records?" Williams asked, settling into his chair with his morning coffee. "Yes, sir. Most of it appears straightforward, but I'm finding some interesting patterns in the donation recipients," Marcus replied carefully, testing the waters to see how much detail he should reveal. Williams raised an eyebrow. "What kind of patterns?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "There appears to be a network of interconnected organizations that receive regular funding. It's probably nothing concerning, but the connections are more extensive than typical charity giving patterns." "Well, keep digging. If there's anything that could pose a security risk, I need to know about it," Williams instructed before turning his attention to other matters. The conversation reinforced Marcus's sense that he was onto something significant. Williams's response suggested that the palace security team was indeed concerned about potential complications arising from charitable activities, even if they weren't sure what form those complications might take. Throughout the morning, Marcus continued mapping the network while maintaining the appearance of routine security work. He discovered that the charitable organizations formed what appeared to be a sophisticated influence operation, with different groups focusing on different aspects of policy and public opinion. Some organizations focused on education and youth development, funding programs that promoted specific approaches to international cooperation and cultural exchange. Others concentrated on environmental issues, but their research consistently supported policy positions that aligned with particular economic and political interests. Still others worked on conflict resolution and humanitarian aid, but their activities often occurred in strategically important regions. Marcus realized he needed to understand Dr. Hartwell's personal background more thoroughly. Using his security clearance, he accessed personnel files from various government departments and academic institutions where she had worked or consulted. What he found was a career that had been carefully constructed to build influence across multiple sectors. Dr. Hartwell had begun her career as a researcher, focusing on post-conflict reconstruction, but she had gradually expanded her expertise to include economic development, cultural preservation, and international relations. Each new area of expertise had brought new connections and new opportunities to influence policy discussions. Her academic work was respected and legitimate, but Marcus noticed that her research consistently supported conclusions that favored certain political and economic approaches over others. Her expertise was often cited in policy documents and government reports, giving her ideas significant influence over official thinking. The afternoon brought a breakthrough when Marcus discovered financial records that showed the true scale of the network. The charitable donations he had been tracking represented only a small portion of the funding flowing through the system. There were also grants from government agencies, contributions from private foundations, and investments from corporations that shared common ownership or leadership. Marcus estimated that the total funding flowing through the network exceeded £50 million annually. This wasn't just charitable giving. It was a sophisticated funding mechanism that supported a wide range of activities designed to influence policy and public opinion. The realization that he had uncovered something far larger than expected left Marcus feeling both excited and concerned. On one hand, he had successfully identified a significant network that could have security implications for the royal family. On the other hand, the scale and sophistication of what he was discovering suggested that he was dealing with something that extended far beyond his normal responsibilities as a protection officer. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon documenting his findings with the meticulous care that his training had taught him. Every connection, every financial flow, every timeline correlation was carefully recorded and cross-referenced. If he was going to present this information to his superiors, he needed to ensure that his evidence was unassailable. As evening approached, Marcus realized that he had reached a critical decision point. The evidence he had gathered clearly showed that the charitable donations were part of a much larger influence network that operated at the highest levels of society. The question was whether this network posed any direct threat to the royal family or simply represented a sophisticated but legal form of political influence. The drive home was filled with internal debate about his next steps. Marcus understood that bringing this information forward could have significant consequences both for his career and for the individuals involved in the network. But he also recognized that his duty as a protection officer required him to identify potential security risks, regardless of how politically sensitive they might be. At home, Marcus spent the evening reviewing his notes and preparing a preliminary report. He needed to present his findings in a way that focused on security implications rather than political judgments. His job was to identify potential risks, not to determine whether the activities he had discovered were appropriate or inappropriate. The challenge was that the network he had uncovered operated in a gray area between legitimate charitable work and political influence operations. There was no evidence of illegal activity, but the level of coordination and the strategic nature of the funding suggested activities that could potentially create conflicts of interest or dependencies that might be exploited. Marcus drafted several versions of his report, trying to find the right balance between thoroughness and discretion. He needed to convey the significance of what he had discovered without overstating the potential security implications or making accusations that weren't supported by evidence. Before going to bed, Marcus made a secure digital copy of all his research materials and stored them in an encrypted folder on a separate device. His years of security work had taught him the importance of protecting sensitive information, and he had a feeling that this investigation was about to enter a new phase that would require extreme caution. As he lay in bed that night, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his routine assignment had evolved over just 2 days. What had started as a simple security review of charitable donations had become an investigation into a sophisticated influence network that connected some of the most powerful people in the country. The weight of responsibility he felt was substantial. The information he had uncovered could potentially impact relationships between the royal family and influential figures across society. It could also shed light on how power and influence actually functioned in modern Britain, revealing connections and mechanisms that most people never saw or understood. Marcus knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges as he prepared to present his findings to Chief Inspector Williams. The response to his report would determine whether this investigation expanded or whether he would be instructed to file his findings and move on to other security matters. Either way, Marcus understood that his discovery of the network had already changed his perspective on his role as a protection officer. He had always known that his job involved more than just physical security, but this investigation had shown him the extent to which financial and political connections could create complex webs of influence that extended far beyond what was visible on the surface. The third day of Marcus's investigation began with an unexpected phone call that would change everything. As he prepared his morning briefing for Chief Inspector Williams, his secure phone rang with a call from Sarah Mitchell, a colleague in the intelligence services whom he had worked with on previous cases. "Marcus, I need to speak with you urgently." Sarah's voice carried an unusual tension. "It's about some research you've been conducting. Can we meet somewhere private?" The call sent a chill through Marcus's spine. How had Sarah learned about his investigation? He had been careful to conduct his research through official security channels, but apparently his activities had attracted attention from other government agencies. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near Westminster Bridge, away from both the palace and the intelligence offices. As Marcus walked through the morning crowds, he couldn't shake the feeling that his investigation had reached a turning point that would have consequences far beyond what he had originally imagined. Sarah was already seated in a corner booth when Marcus arrived. Her expression was serious, and she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Marcus, the network you've been investigating, we've been watching it for over a year," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "What you've discovered is just the surface of something much larger." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "How do you know what I've been investigating?" Certain database queries trigger automatic alerts when they involve sensitive individuals. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell is one of those individuals, Sarah explained. When your searches reached a certain threshold, our systems flagged it for review. The revelation that Dr. Hartwell was already under intelligence surveillance added a new dimension to Marcus's investigation. It also raised questions about whether his role as a protection officer had inadvertently led him into the middle of an ongoing intelligence operation. Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The network you've identified is what we call an influence constellation, a group of interconnected organizations and individuals who work together to shape policy and public opinion. Dr. Hartwell is one of the central figures, but she's not the only one. Is it a security threat? Marcus asked, thinking about his responsibilities to protect the royal family. That's complicated, Sarah replied. The network isn't engaged in anything illegal, but their level of influence over government policy is concerning. They've managed to position themselves as advisors and experts across multiple departments, giving them significant input into decisions that affect millions of people. Sarah explained that the intelligence services have been tracking the network's activities because of concerns about foreign connections and funding sources. While Dr. Hartwell and her associates appeared to be operating in British interests, some of their funding came from sources that had ties to foreign governments and international corporations. The charitable donations from the royal household are particularly concerning because they provide legitimacy and credibility to the network, Sarah continued. When organizations receive patronage from the royal family, it opens doors and creates opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Marcus began to understand the broader implications of what he had discovered. The charitable donations weren't just acts of philanthropy. They were inadvertently providing royal endorsement to a sophisticated influence operation that operated largely outside public scrutiny. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked, realizing that his investigation had become part of something much larger than a routine security review. Sarah pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents. "We need you to continue your investigation, but now you'll be working with us to understand the full scope of the network's activities. We believe there are connections you haven't discovered yet." The photograph showed Dr. Hartwell at various private gatherings with individuals Marcus didn't recognize. Sarah identified them as foreign diplomats, business leaders, and politicians from several different countries. The settings appeared to be exclusive social events held at luxury resorts and private estates around the world. "These aren't official diplomatic meetings," Sarah explained. "They're informal gatherings where policy ideas are discussed and agreements are reached outside the normal government channels. Dr. Hartwell serves as a bridge between these international contacts and British policymakers." Marcus studied the photographs, noting the relaxed atmosphere and expensive settings. It was clear that these gatherings were designed to build personal relationships and trust among participants, creating networks of influence that could be activated when needed. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus asked. "We believe the current configuration has been developing for about 5 years, but some of the relationships go back much longer," Sarah replied. Dr. Hartwell began building her network while she was still primarily focused on academic work, but it's evolved into something much more sophisticated. Sarah showed Marcus additional documents that revealed the true scope of the network's influence. Policy papers written by network-affiliated researchers had been cited in government reports across multiple departments. Recommendations from network organizations had influenced decisions on everything from foreign aid allocation to trade policy. The concerning part is how effective they've been at influencing policy without most government officials realizing they're dealing with a coordinated network, Sarah continued. Each contact appears independent, but they're actually part of a larger strategy. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what he was learning. His simple investigation into charitable donations had revealed a sophisticated influence operation that reached into the highest levels of government and extended across international boundaries. "What about the royal family? Are they aware of these connections?" Marcus asked, thinking about his primary responsibility to protect them from potential security risks. "We don't believe they have any knowledge of the broader network," Sarah replied. "The charitable donations appear to be genuine philanthropic gestures based on presentations and proposals that look legitimate on the surface. However," Sarah explained that the intelligence services were concerned about the potential for the royal family to be manipulated or used to legitimize activities they wouldn't approve of if they understood the full context. The network had been careful to present only the most positive aspects of their work while keeping their broader political activities hidden. "We need you to continue your investigation from inside the palace security apparatus," Sarah said. "Your access to royal financial records and your ability to conduct security reviews gives us insights we can't get through other means." Marcus agreed to continue the investigation, but he insisted that his primary loyalty remained to his responsibilities as a royal protection officer. If he discovered anything that posed a direct threat to the royal family, that information would take precedence over intelligence-gathering objectives. Sarah provided Marcus with additional resources for his investigation, including access to international databases and specialized analytical tools that would help him map the full extent of the network's activities. She also gave him contact information for other intelligence officers who were working on related aspects of the case. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Sarah emphasized the importance of maintaining the appearance of a routine security investigation. The network has sophisticated monitoring capabilities, and they'll become suspicious if they detect unusual interest in their activities. The walk back to the palace gave Marcus time to process everything he had learned. His investigation had evolved from a security review into an intelligence operation that could potentially expose a hidden mechanism of political influence that operated across multiple countries. Back at his office, Marcus began incorporating the new information into his analysis. The additional resources provided by the intelligence services revealed connections he had missed during his initial investigation. The network was even larger and more sophisticated than he had realized. Marcus discovered that Dr. Hartwell's organization had connections to similar networks in other countries, suggesting a coordinated international effort to influence policy across multiple governments. The charitable donations from the British royal family were part of a pattern that included similar endorsements and funding from influential figures around the world. The afternoon brought new revelations as Marcus used the enhanced analytical tools to map financial flows and communication patterns within the network. He discovered that information and strategic coordination flowed between organizations in ways that suggested centralized planning and coordination. Most concerning was the discovery that the network had been particularly active around major policy decisions and international negotiations. Their research papers and recommendations appear to be timed to influence key decisions at crucial moments. As evening approached, Marcus realized that he was dealing with something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how democratic societies functioned. The network represented a shadow system of influence that operated largely outside public knowledge or accountability. The weight of this responsibility was becoming increasingly apparent to Marcus. His investigation had revealed information that could potentially reshape public understanding of how political decisions were really made, but it also posed significant risks to the royal family and to his own career. Before leaving the office, Marcus prepared a detailed but carefully worded progress report for Chief Inspector Williams. He needed to convey the significance of his discoveries without revealing the intelligence service's involvement or the full scope of what he had learned. The report would be a delicate balancing act, providing enough information to fulfill his security responsibilities while protecting the ongoing intelligence investigation. Marcus understood that his next conversation with Williams would determine how this entire situation would proceed. The morning of Marcus's meeting with Chief Inspector Williams arrived with an ominous feeling that settled in his chest like a lead weight. He had spent most of the night refining his report, trying to present his findings in a way that would protect both the ongoing intelligence investigation and his own position within the palace security structure. Williams was waiting in his office when Marcus arrived, but he wasn't alone. Seated across from the chief inspector was a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of composed demeanor that suggested significant authority. Williams's expression was unusually serious as he gestured for Marcus to take a seat. "Thompson, this is Director James Ashford from Cabinet Office Security," Williams said, his voice carrying a formality that Marcus had rarely heard before. "He's here to discuss your investigation into the charitable donation records." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The presence of someone from the Cabinet Office suggested that his investigation had attracted attention at the highest levels of government. He wasn't sure whether this was good news or bad news, but it certainly meant that the situation was more serious than he had anticipated. Director Ashford leaned forward slightly, studying Marcus with penetrating gray eyes. Mr. Thompson, we understand you've been conducting a thorough review of certain charitable activities. We'd like to hear about your findings. Marcus carefully presented his preliminary report, focusing on the security implications of the interconnected network while avoiding any mention of his collaboration with the intelligence services. He described the patterns he had identified, the connections between organizations, and the potential for these relationships to create vulnerabilities or dependencies. As Marcus spoke, he watched Ashford's reaction carefully. The director showed no surprise at any of the information, suggesting that he was already familiar with at least some aspects of the network Marcus had discovered. Williams, on the other hand, appeared increasingly concerned as the scope of the connections became clear. These are significant findings, Ashford said when Marcus finished his presentation. However, we need to discuss how this information will be handled moving forward. The director explained that the charitable network Marcus had investigated was already known to various government departments, but that knowledge was compartmentalized across different agencies and security services. No single agency had developed the comprehensive overview that Marcus had compiled through his investigation. The challenge we face is that this network operates in a gray area between legitimate charitable work and political influence activities, Ashford continued. They haven't violated any laws, but their level of coordination and influence raises questions about transparency and accountability. Marcus realized that his investigation had potentially exposed gaps in the government's ability to monitor and understand sophisticated influence operations. Each agency had been tracking pieces of the network, but no one had connected all the dots to see the full picture. What concerns us most is the potential for the royal family to be unwittingly used to legitimize activities they wouldn't support if they understood the full context, Ashford explained. Your findings suggest that's exactly what has been happening. The director pulled out a folder containing additional documents that Marcus hadn't seen before. These showed that the network's activities had expanded significantly over the past year, with new organizations being established and new connections being formed across multiple sectors of society. We believe the network is preparing for a major expansion of their influence operations, Ashford said. The charitable donations from the royal household appear to be part of a strategy to build credibility before launching more aggressive policy advocacy efforts. Marcus studied the new documents, noting dates and connections that aligned with patterns he had already identified. The additional information confirmed his suspicions that the network was operating according to a sophisticated strategic plan rather than simply responding to charitable opportunities. What do you need from me? Marcus asked, understanding that his role in this situation was about to change significantly. Ashford exchanged glances with Williams before responding. We need you to continue your investigation, but now you'll be working directly with a joint task force that includes representatives from multiple agencies. Your unique position within the palace security structure gives us access to information and perspectives we can't get elsewhere. The director explained that the task force had been established to develop a comprehensive understanding of influence networks that operated across government, business, and civil society. Marcus's investigation had provided crucial insights that helped connect activities that had previously appeared unrelated. However, this assignment comes with significant risks, Ashford warned. If the network becomes aware that we're conducting a coordinated investigation, they could take steps to protect themselves that might compromise both the investigation and the individuals involved. Marcus understood the implications. His continued involvement would require him to maintain the appearance of conducting routine security reviews while actually participating in a sophisticated intelligence operation. The risk to his career and potentially his safety would be substantial. Chief Inspector Williams spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Thompson, I want you to understand that this is entirely voluntary. If you choose not to continue with this investigation, there will be no negative consequences for your career or your position here. The offer gave Marcus a moment to consider his options. He could return to his normal duties as a protection officer, filing his current findings as a completed security review. Alternatively, he could accept the risks and continue with an investigation that could potentially expose one of the most sophisticated influence operations in British political history. Marcus thought about his years of service protecting the royal family and his deep sense of duty to ensure their security and reputation. The evidence he had uncovered clearly showed that they were being used in ways they didn't understand, potentially compromising their independence and integrity. I'll continue with the investigation, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the anxiety he felt. But I need guarantees about how this information will be used and what protections will be in place for the royal family. Ashford nodded approvingly. The primary objective is to protect the royal family from being manipulated or compromised. Any actions taken as a result of this investigation will prioritize their security and reputation above all other considerations. The director provided Marcus with new resources and contacts for the expanded investigation. He would now have access to international intelligence databases and coordination with security services in other countries where similar networks have been identified. We believe this network is part of a broader phenomenon of sophisticated influence operations that operate across multiple democracies, Ashford explained. Your investigation may help us understand not just what's happening in Britain, but how these networks function internationally. The meeting concluded with detailed instructions for Marcus's new role within the Joint Task Force. He would continue to operate from his position within the palace security structure, but he would now report his findings to the task force while maintaining his normal security responsibilities. As Williams and Ashford prepared to leave, the director turned back to Marcus with a final warning. Thompson, the people you're investigating are extremely sophisticated and well-connected. They have resources and influence that extend far beyond what appears on the surface. Be extremely careful about who you trust and how you conduct your research. The afternoon was spent reviewing new materials and planning the next phase of the investigation. Marcus now had access to information that revealed the true scope of the network's international connections and their sophisticated methods for influencing policy across multiple countries. The enhanced intelligence showed that Dr. Hartwell and her associates were part of a coordinated effort that included similar figures in the United States, Canada, Australia, and several European countries. The networks in each country operated independently, but shared information and coordinated their activities around major international issues. Marcus realized that he was no longer investigating just a British influence network, but rather a piece of what appeared to be a global system for shaping policy and public opinion outside the normal democratic processes. The implications were staggering and potentially threatening to the foundations of democratic governance. The weight of responsibility he now carried was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his career. The information he was gathering could potentially reshape public understanding of how international politics really functioned, but it also posed enormous risks to everyone involved. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Marcus understood that his life had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a protection officer conducting a routine security review. He had become a key participant in an investigation that could expose one of the most significant threats to democratic accountability in modern history. The drive home was filled with reflection on the magnitude of what he had discovered and what lay ahead. Marcus knew that the coming weeks would test not only his investigative skills, but also his courage and his commitment to protecting the democratic institutions he had sworn to serve. 3 months after Marcus Thompson first opened that manila folder containing charitable donation records, he found himself in a secure conference room deep within Whitehall, surrounded by officials from intelligence services, government departments, and international allies. The investigation that had begun as a routine security review had evolved into one of the most significant intelligence operations in recent British history. The room was filled with charts, documents, and digital displays showing the complex web of connections that Marcus had helped to uncover. What had started with Dr. Eleanor Hartwell and a few charitable organizations had grown to encompass a global network of influence operations that reached into the highest levels of government across multiple democratic countries. Director Ashford stood at the head of the table, addressing the assembled officials. Thanks to the initial work of Mr. Thompson and the subsequent joint investigation, we now understand the scope and sophistication of what we're dealing with. This network represents a new form of soft power projection that operates largely outside traditional diplomatic and political channels. Marcus listened as Ashford described how the investigation had revealed influence networks in 12 different countries, all following similar patterns and apparently coordinated through informal but sophisticated communication channels. The charitable donations that had first caught Marcus's attention were just one small piece of a much larger strategy. The network had succeeded in placing their research and recommendations at the center of policy discussions across multiple governments, often without officials realizing they were dealing with coordinated advocacy rather than independent expert analysis. The level of influence they had achieved was unprecedented in its scope and subtlety. The question we face now is how to address this situation without undermining legitimate charitable work and academic freedom, Ashford continued. We can't simply shut down organizations that haven't violated any laws, but we also can't allow democratic governance to be subverted by hidden influence operations. Marcus had spent weeks helping to develop recommendations for how governments could protect themselves from sophisticated influence operations while preserving the openness that democratic societies required. The solutions were complex and would require international coordination and new forms of transparency. The primary recommendation was the establishment of new disclosure requirements for organizations that sought to influence policy, particularly those with significant international connections or funding. The goal was to ensure that government officials and the public could understand when they were dealing with coordinated advocacy efforts rather than independent research. For the royal family, the recommendations included enhanced security reviews of all charitable partnerships and donations, with particular attention to organizations that had political advocacy components. The goal was to protect the royal family from being used to legitimize political activities they hadn't explicitly endorsed. Marcus had been asked to lead the implementation of the new security protocols for royal charitable activities. It was a significant promotion that recognized both his investigative skills and his deep understanding of the threats that sophisticated influence operations pose to the monarchy's independence and credibility. The personal cost of the investigation had been substantial. Marcus had spent months living with the stress of conducting a highly sensitive intelligence operation while maintaining his normal security duties. His relationships with colleagues had been strained by the secrecy requirements, and the weight of responsibility had taken a toll on his health and sleep. However, the investigation had also given Marcus a profound sense of accomplishment. His careful attention to detail and willingness to pursue suspicious patterns had potentially protected democratic institutions from a sophisticated threat that most people never would have recognized. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell and her associates had not been arrested or prosecuted, as they had not violated any existing laws. However, the exposure of their network's true scope and coordination had effectively ended their ability to operate with the same level of influence. New transparency requirements would make it much more difficult for similar networks to develop without public awareness. The investigation had also led to important reforms in how government departments evaluated research and policy recommendations. New protocols required officials to understand the funding sources and potential conflicts of interest of organizations that sought to influence policy, making it much harder for coordinated influence operations to succeed. International cooperation had been a crucial aspect of addressing the network's global reach. Marcus had worked with security officials from allied countries to share information and coordinate responses. The investigation had revealed that democratic countries were facing similar threats and needed to work together to protect their institutions. 6 months after the investigation concluded, Marcus was settling into his new role overseeing royal security protocols for charitable activities. The work was challenging but rewarding, as it allowed him to use his experience to protect the royal family from future attempts at manipulation while ensuring they could continue their important charitable work. The enhanced security protocols had already identified several other attempts to use charitable partnerships to gain unwarranted influence or access. In each case, Marcus and his team were able to provide the royal family with the information they needed to make informed decisions about their philanthropic activities. Marcus's experience had taught him that protecting democratic institutions required constant vigilance and sophisticated understanding of how influence operations evolved and adapted. The network he had exposed represented just one example of how power could be exercised outside traditional political channels in ways that undermine transparency and accountability. The broader implications of the investigation continued to influence policy discussions across multiple government departments. The revelation that sophisticated influence networks could operate largely undetected for years had sparked important conversations about how democratic societies could protect themselves from hidden manipulation while preserving the openness and freedom that made democracy valuable. For Marcus personally, the investigation had transformed his understanding of his role as a protection officer. He no longer saw his responsibilities as limited to physical security, but understood that protecting the royal family required understanding and defending against sophisticated threats to their independence and integrity. The investigation had also deepened his appreciation for the importance of democratic institutions and the need to protect them from those who would manipulate them for their own purposes. The royal family's independence from political influence was not just important for the monarchy, but was crucial for the broader health of British democratic society. As Marcus reflected on the events that had begun with a simple review of charitable donations, he realized that his willingness to pursue suspicious patterns and ask difficult questions had potentially prevented a significant compromise of democratic governance. The network he had exposed might have continued operating indefinitely if not for his careful attention to details that others might have overlooked. The investigation had shown that protecting democracy required individuals who were willing to look beyond surface appearances and pursue uncomfortable truths, even when doing so involved personal risk and professional uncertainty. Marcus's experience demonstrated that ordinary civil servants, working within their assigned responsibilities, could play crucial roles in protecting democratic institutions from sophisticated threats. Looking ahead, Marcus understood that the threats to democratic governance would continue to evolve and become more sophisticated. His role in protecting the royal family from manipulation would require ongoing vigilance and adaptation as new forms of influence operations emerged. The investigation that had begun with curiosity about charitable donation patterns had evolved into a career-defining experience that had tested Marcus's courage, integrity, and commitment to public service. The resolution had protected both the royal family and broader democratic institutions from a sophisticated threat that few people had understood or recognized. Marcus's story demonstrated that democracy depended not just on formal institutions and legal protections, but on individuals who were willing to ask difficult questions and pursue uncomfortable truths when they encountered evidence that something wasn't right. His careful documentation and persistent investigation had exposed a threat that could have fundamentally altered how democratic governance functioned, without most people ever realizing what was happening. The investigation's success had required not just individual courage, but also institutional support for officials who were willing to pursue sensitive investigations when they believed democratic institutions were at risk. The collaboration between different agencies and departments had been crucial for understanding the full scope of the threat and developing effective responses. As Marcus continued his work protecting the royal family's charitable activities, he carried with him the knowledge that his vigilance and attention to detail could make the difference between democratic governance that served the public interest and governance that was secretly shaped by hidden networks pursuing their own agenda. The responsibility was weighty, but it was also a privilege to serve in a role that could protect institutions that were fundamental to British society and democratic governance around the world.